for the day. We have a lot to kind of cover, but it's all going to be like really exciting stuff. And so please, throughout the presentation, stop us if you have questions or comments. We're really excited to share this information with all of you. So we're going to start with kind of a welcome overview that I'm doing now. We'll get into introductions and kind of ask all of you to introduce yourself. We have a prompt to answer as well. We'll go over SANDAG's anti-displacement strategy. And then we'll hear from a case study from the city of San Diego. Then we'll jump into hearing from kind of another set of consultants sharing about our framing displacement strategies and tenant protections and how they relate to housing elements and AFFH, and kind of give a little bit of overview there. And then we're going to jump into affordable housing preservation and alternative forms of home ownership. So we have some outside speakers for that. And then we'll get into Q&A and then end on a conclusion and upcoming steps. So a lot to get through, but a lot of exciting things. And with that, we can get into introductions. So I'll hand it over to Matt to kind of kick off introduce some of our speakers, and then we will go into SANDAG staff from there.
Well, hello, everyone. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Matt Geldman, Senior Planner at Ascent and leading the consultant team for the HAP TA program. I have the privilege of introducing all of our wonderful speakers just by name at the moment. And if you all want to share any more about your organization or your role and why you're here today, when you present your slides, that would be appreciated. But right next to me, I have Farzad from LaSAR, who's going to be presenting about the SANDAG strategy, along with Ari from Global Policy Leadership Academy. They're going to be co-presenting, right? Okay. And then from the city of San Diego, Jeff Ryan's going to be sharing a little bit about what the city is doing for anti-displacement at the moment. And then we will have Winnie Fong from Estelano Advisors kind of introduce some of the specific policies and case studies we'll be walking through today. Specifically, we have Brisa Aviles today from Tierras Indígenas Community Land Trust, who's going to be sharing about some exciting work going on in the San Diego region in conjunction with Leo Goldberg from the California Community Land Trust Network. So we have a lot of speakers today and a lot to get through. So with that, I think we're going to turn it over to introduction from all of our attendees today. So we want to start in person and then. Yeah,
let's go ahead and start in person. And we have for the next slide, we just want to hear your name, your jurisdiction, and then kind of maybe one person from the jurisdiction can kind of summarize this. You just kind of have one representative speak to it, but what, if any, are there any anti-displacement strategies you're working on, any that you specifically want to know about? We just kind of want to do some collective sharing on who's working on this in the region and kind of areas you might have questions, challenges, or something you're looking forward to in terms of anti-displacement work. So we can start on this side. Do you want to kick us off?
Sure, yeah. So hi, I'm Joel Savetko with the city of Encinitas. And yeah, we're working on a displacement risk study right now, sort of an economic analysis of the parts of the city that are most at risk of displacement. And in terms of struggles right now, we're in the middle of the process and we're having trouble finding good data on evictions within the city. So that's sort of been a hang up for us right now, but yeah, we're working through it and we'll have it delivered here soon.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jeff Ryan. I'm a development project manager from the housing policy team for the city of San Diego. Some things that we're kind of interested, or at least I'm interested in, is I'm really interested to hear about living trusts and alternative home ownership models and kind of escaping that binary world of either own or.
Hi everyone, I'm Sean McGee. I'm a senior planner on the housing policy team with the city planning department for the city of San Diego. And I'm going to echo what Jeff said for number 3. Just really want to learn more about land trust.
Hey, my name is Robin Luna, the city of Encinitas as well. Assistant planner there. Yeah, and I think as Joel mentioned, we are connected to displacement study as well, which is coming up as well.
Leilani Hines, City of Oceanside. I'm the housing director. You know, we're facing a lot of political pressure right now. We're going gangbusters with development, and unfortunately, it is moving into areas that are lower income. And so anecdotally, we get every council meeting, every housing commission meeting, folks that are talking about being displaced. And so we're just starting to get into that work about how do we keep our Oceanside local residents in place and still having a place versus all the newer downtown higher development.
Hi everyone, my name is Priscilla Goldon. I work for the city of Escondido. I'm an associate planner, and really I'm excited to learn about all the anti-displacement strategies that SANDAG has come up with, especially in the midst of just the housing crisis that we have and the acceleration in work needs.
Hi everyone, I'm Veronica Morones. I'm a principal planner for the city of Escondido. I do all of our long-range section work. As all of you who've worked on your housing elements know, there's quite a few things that HCD probably made you incorporate into your AFFH programs. And so, you know, ours range from anything from an affordable housing trust fund and then loopy to reviewing existing ordinances for, you know, criminalization and things of that nature. So really just interested to get more information from this. I'm happy that you all are hosting this. It's really great. So.
You can go to staff online. I'm not sure. Okay, how about Grant from the city of San Diego? I see you're just first on my list. So if you want to start, and then Sandy, and then Beth.
I'm Grant Rorty, Senior Planner, City of San Diego. I'm just interested in the subject matter. I'm also very much interested in community land trust. I think they're a way of dealing with land rent and making housing more affordable. So I'm interested in learning more about that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Sandy Sawa Hazelwood, City of La Mesa, similar to City of Escondido. We're starting to get into our housing element implementation. So interested to hearing what others are doing within the region.
Thank you. Beth, do you want to go ahead? And then Bunch. Beth, I saw you on mute for a moment. There you go. Okay, how about Bungie? You want to go, and then Manuel and Melissa?
Sure, Eric Bungie, City of Escondido. I echo Veronica's statements.
Thanks. And go ahead, Manuel. Okay, we're unable to hear you if you're trying to speak. Maybe you just want to introduce yourself in the chat. We'll go ahead and move on to Melissa and then Patty. Go ahead, Patty, I see you.
Hi, in addition to Patty Anders, I'm the planning manager over advanced planning and all things housing in the city of Encinitas. In addition to what Joel and Robin shared, we are having a lot of a high learning curve on terms of implementing housing law when it comes to current planning applications that have housing units on site, both deed restricted and just low income. And when property owners don't have income information, and navigating that whole legal landscape of how do you require replacement housing. So that's really something that we're dealing with on a regular basis now, in addition to all of our wonderful housing implementation requirements that Veronica mentioned. So it's really both current planning and advanced planning that we're having to deal with some of the displacement. So I'd like to really learn a lot from the team on how they're handling loss of existing housing and replacement.
Great. Okay, Manuel, I'm trying to unmute. There you go. You should be unmuted.
Yes, hello, my name is Manuel Perez with the City of Oceanside. I am just kind of helping Leilani out and assisting her, but we are looking for an angle for the anti-displacement policy that would help mitigate obviously the gentrification, displacement, and obviously to preserve racial and socioeconomic diversity in our community. So I've looked at, I think San Francisco came out with a policy and the city of Redwood did one. And so I'm curious to learn more about techniques and things to look out for in implementing a policy.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna, Beth or Melissa, if either of you are able to unmute and introduce yourselves, please go ahead. If not, please just introduce yourself in the chat so we can continue. If there's anyone I missed, let's go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat in the essence of time. Okay, so with that, before we jump into the presentations, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce a couple of SANDAG staff and new SANDAG staff members that have joined us, specifically some that'll be working on the anti-displacement strategy. I guess I forgot to introduce myself briefly. I'm Carrie Simmons, Regional Planner on our Sustainable Communities team. I manage on SANDAG side the HAP technical assistance work, also our Sustainable Communities Working Group, and various other housing related tasks under our Housing Acceleration Program. We have Thomas here in the room, and Jolie, and Stacy, and Lizzie, and Tueri back there. In the essence of time, we'll just kind of, I'll list them by name. But I did want to allow our new senior planner, Sarah, to introduce herself and give you a little bit about her and what she'll be working on.
Thank you, Karen. My name is Sarah Tillman. I'm joining the SANDAG team. I'm going to be basically part of the anti-displacement strategies. I work for the city of San Diego. I recently come from the city of San Clemente, and I also work for the city of Temecula. So I have a good handle on local government strategies and how they try to implement things. So I'm hoping that can bring that into this.
Great. And then also,
Oh yes, and then I worked at she's gonna also assist me. I don't know if you said you want to give a little something about yourself or.
I'm Chesley DeLeon. I've been an intern for SANDAG for 5 months, but I've recently become a planner 1 for the Sustainable Communities team. And yeah, I'll be working with anti-displacement strategy.
great. Okay, and with that, I see your comment, Adi. For the most part, if people speaking, we just need to be loud and try to speak to the front so that the people online can hear. If there's any other technical difficulties like that, just go ahead and put in the chat and we'll try to address them. So with that, we'll get into our first kind of item. Take it away, Prasad.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining online and for everyone being here in person. Like I said, I'm Farzad Mashoud. I'm a senior associate with WSAR Development Consultants. And I'm our project manager for the SANDAG anti-displacement study for the consultant team. We've been working on this project since September of 2022, and the project goes into January of 2024. Today's presentation, we're going to talk about different anti-displacement strategies and what we've been doing on this project. So I'll give a brief overview of what we've done. And most of our presentation today will focus on where we're going. Many of you talked today about different anti-displacement policies that your cities are implementing as part of your AFFH analysis and component of your housing elements. Anti-displacement, as I think was mentioned earlier, is very closely connected to AFFH. So we kind of see this work as helping cities to implement the AFFH elements of their housing element, or aspects of their housing. So that's kind of one intention we're presenting today's content on is as a way to help cities in their duty to meet to affirmatively further fair housing. So that is there. No, it should work.
Is it on the side?
On the side. So well, anyway, yeah, the next slide gives a brief overview of the presentation. Very good. So what we've done is we've conducted what we called an existing conditions assessment. This is a data analysis that includes a report and a map that describes existing conditions throughout the region at the neighborhood level, the census tract level. Then another component of the project we've completed is our best practices research. And this is looking at policies that can prevent displacement. Then, like I mentioned, we'll be focusing the presentation on what remains, which is the anti-displacement toolkit. That's the ultimate outcome of this project, is something for you as local jurisdiction staff to be able to use. And we'll have some facilitated feedback to get your input on the initial work we've completed on the toolkit. Great. So just to begin, we want to talk about how the anti-displacement study and strategy are defining displacement and identify some examples of the drivers of displacement. So when we talk about displacement, this is of course one of the biggest challenges in the San Diego region. It's a regional problem and it needs regional solutions. And what we're specifically talking about is residential displacement, is the challenge of households to afford the cost of living and thus being forced to leave their home through reasons beyond their control. These reasons can include the drivers listed there: drastic rent increases, evictions, neighborhood change, natural disasters, and more. And displacement is very much seen at the hyper-local level by individual households or in neighborhoods. But again, I want to emphasize displacement is a regional challenge and it requires regional solutions. So it's really great to see everybody here for that purpose. An important element also it's been kind of a thread throughout this project is the connection between displacement pressure and mobility improvements or transit improvements. So as the region looks to improve its transit, particularly trains as well as buses, more affordable neighborhoods may become more popular and they'll see their rents rise as a result of improvements to the area, particularly through transit improvements. So this is where it's especially important that SANDAG is involved in this project and is leading this project, is to consider what sorts of policies can be implemented alongside these sort of transit improvements so that those living in neighborhoods can continue to benefit from it. So this is a slide that gives a brief overview again of those three components of the project. And as I mentioned earlier, we've completed the existing conditions assessment, and that component of the project looked at data for displacement risk throughout the region. We've completed the best practices research, which identifies policies that prevent displacement. We look both at short-term and long-term policies. And then we're moving towards creating the anti-displacement toolkit. I wanted to emphasize also that this anti-displacement study was identified as a need in the 2021 regional plan. And throughout this work, as you see from the top of the slide, we've been engaged in stakeholder engagement, talking to community members who have lived expertise of displacement, talking to community-based organizations, housing developers, and others. And now we're here talking local jurisdiction staff. So again, what we're focused on, our main focus today is to talk about the toolkit, where we've gotten and where we're going. So I'll give a brief overview of the existing conditions assessment and the key findings. We can include a link in the chat with a link to this report, including the map, in case you haven't looked at it. So just real quick, I'll highlight the 4 key findings from this study. The first is that displacement is a significant problem throughout the San Diego County region. It's not exclusive to any city, not exclusive to any part of the region, and it's seen in both urban and suburban areas, as well as exurban areas, to a lesser extent in rural areas. A second key finding is that almost all remaining affordable neighborhoods in the county are also experiencing displacement. This means that if a household is being displaced out of its neighborhood, there are very few options for places for those households to move to. This suggests that many households are likely being forced to leave the region entirely. Third key finding is that San Diego has a severe lack of rental units affordable to households earning less than 50% of area median income. This forces households to double up or triple up, or spend far beyond what is considered a reasonable amount of their income on rent. And a corollary to this has been the steep rent increases in recent years that have put greater and greater pressure on households. And then the last key finding we wanted to note here is that while people of all races and ethnicities live in areas experiencing displacement, San Diego County's Latino and Black populations are most affected by displacement. There's also strong anecdotal evidence, although the data are not able to drill down into this, that many of San Diego's refugee and asylee migrant groups tend to live in areas experiencing displacement. So those are the 4 key findings of the report. We then took this report to community members and other stakeholders, shared the results, confirmed the validity, and heard these key themes that I'm going to give to my colleague Ari to describe.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ari Puniki. I'm with the Global Policy Leadership Academy. We are a subcontractor in this project that led some of the stakeholder engagements. So I'm just going to take you through some of the findings from the stakeholder engagement and share those with you today. The stakeholder groups really confirmed some of the report's data findings and gave us some essential takeaways that we've highlighted on this slide. So the first of which is that, there's rising costs of living. That includes rent, but it also includes, high utility costs and high deposit requirements that all contribute to, having a higher impact on their level of affordability. The second piece is that there's widespread harassment and abuse by landlords. We included in the report some experiences from the different folks we talked to. We heard from folks who reported hazardous living conditions and not having, different issues with the apartment, whether it be maintenance issues. We heard, one ceiling collapse, stories like that really highlighted the fact that a lot of landlords aren't taking responsibility over their requirements to really maintain their units. Another impact was that there's a lack of enforcement on the few renter protections that exist today. People reported rent increases beyond what's allowed by state law, but they also mentioned that they had no means to fight the increases, especially if they had a migration status that wasn't, that caused them to be fearful for reporting them. So one of the things that, we heard over and over again is how do we enforce the rules? Where do we access the rules? Where do we access the rules in our language? So that was a big piece of it, which really leads us to the fourth piece here, which is limited knowledge on the renter protections and rights. So just knowing, what are my rights? Where can I access them? Where can I access them in my language again? Other takeaways that we have here is that there's a need for regional resources to connect low-income renters with affordable housing options and resources. Something that came up with our stakeholder engagement with CBOs, service providers, as well as with our community level engagements. And then finally, people are displaced throughout the region and to other parts of the US. We heard about a particular trend of people relocating from San Diego to Mexico. And this confirms the binational nature of the region as well.
Thanks, Ari. So those were the key findings and takeaways from the stakeholder engagement of the very sobering existing conditions analysis. Now I'll give a brief overview of the best practices report and the policies that we found that can help prevent displacement. So the key takeaway of our research as a result of looking at academic studies as well as policy practices and analyses of policies in place is that it takes a variety of approaches and a coherent set of policies around the 3 areas listed on this slide to truly prevent displacement and to both meet the short-term and long-term needs of communities. These needs may differ across different populations, communities, and geographic areas, which is why it was important for us to also take these policy analysis to community members, and also why it's important for us in this setting to think about what are the different types of communities in the region and how do policies play out in those communities. So I'll just review what these are and then we'll go into a little bit more depth. But the policies that are needed are policies that support neighborhood stability, that ensure an adequate and abundant supply of housing in the region through producing more housing, and then also policies to preserve affordability. So again, we want to take some time then to pay attention to the unique needs of the region to see how these policies play out in different parts of the region. These are these are actually all of the production policies that the best practices report looked at. We don't have time in this session to talk about them in detail, but we encourage you to review the report, which you can also include a link to a draft of it that's online. And these are policies that you're all very familiar with as a way of accelerating production to meet net targets, including increasing housing production throughout cities, equitable transit-oriented development, ADU incentives. I know many cities have. These are the preservation policies we reviewed for this report. When we talk about preservation, we mean preserving affordability, not necessarily, we're not talking about historic preservation. The two are kind of talked about together. We're talking about price restrictions and the price of homes. So again, many of these I'm sure you're familiar with, such as the acquisition and rehabilitation of market rate housing, restrictions on condominium conversions, a couple policies called TOPA and COPA on the right side that give a first right of refusal to either community groups or residents to purchase their apartments when they go for sale, as well as hiring staff focus on preservation and also some cities have. And then these are the stability policies that our analysis identified. These generally work to prevent displacement in the short term, whereas the production policies work more in the long term. These include, again, policies you're familiar with, like rent stabilization and rental assistance, and also policies I think that were talked about earlier today, like right to return policies. When your building is replaced, that you can return to the new building at the same rent. We included some analysis on local preference policies, as well as anti-harassment policies in response to what we heard in the community feedback, as well as the other policies listed here. I also want to underscore like expanding homeownership as a means to help people avoid the instability associated with renting. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague Ari again to review the key takeaways from what we heard from stakeholder groups.
Thank you, Farzad. So we spoke to 4 different groups of stakeholders over the course of this engagement. We spoke to CBOs and service providers, talked to city and county staff, we talked to impacted community members, and we also talked to housing developers. So as we went through the different best practices, I'll kind of go over which theme was prioritized by which group and some different themes that stood out from the stakeholder engagements. So when talking to the CBOs and service providers, we saw that preservation was something that was prioritized. We saw that there was a lot of support for CLTs, extending existing affordability covenants, so things like that. And then just a desire to unlock vacant and underutilized land. So these are just some, this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are some of the things that we heard in those engagements. We met with city and county staff as well at the with the Sustainable Communities Working Group. We heard support for inclusionary policies, as well as support for policies that result in the production of new affordable housing. And we really saw that the production theme was prioritized through those conversations. When talking to impacted community members, stability was prioritized. We saw there was a lot of support for creating access to rental assistance, tenant legal services, and rent stabilization. Obviously, some of these are, technical challenges and some of these are political. And so, as planners, some of these will be tools in your toolbox and some of them will require some political support. So just something to think about. There was also support for preservation policies such as TOPA and COPA and homeowner rehabilitation programs. And there was also support for policies that created new affordable housing. So really support for all of the different themes, but stability was by far, what we heard the most from folks. We heard a lot of really desperate situations for folks that really spoke to the need for kind of short-term or near-term solutions to just kind of stop the bleed, if you will. And finally, we spoke to housing developers where the production theme was prioritized in comments. They supported streamlining as well as reducing, policies that would reduce regulatory barriers. But there was some skepticism on preventing condo conversions as a preservation strategy. They mentioned that condo conversions can be a way to create access to home ownership at a lower price point. They also mentioned that they were skeptical of stability policies that layer bureaucracy onto developers or landlords. One of the things that we heard from folks is that some of these policies, such as rent stabilization or, additional tenant rights created, contradictory incentives for them. And so they just, voiced their skepticism on layering more and more regulations on top of our existing set. So just kind of wanted to summarize what we heard from the different groups and what they prioritize in their input.
Thanks, Ari. So that's where we've been. Now I'm going to focus us on where we're going. Like I said, ultimately we want to create an anti-displacement toolkit. And as a first step to creating our anti-displacement toolkit, we've decided to think of the region in terms of different typologies of communities. So as a result of looking at both the existing conditions and the best practices, we said, okay, we got to look at this toolkit, but we want to think about how do we prioritize policies for the unique conditions of different parts of the region. So what we want to know in this meeting is this construct that I'm going to present helpful? Would you use it? And how can we kind of refine it? So in order to create different typologies of communities, we looked at different data points. We looked at the level of displacement risk. We looked at the tenure mix in the neighborhood. We looked at how affordable the neighborhood is. And then we also looked at SANDAG's designation of mobility hub plans for that neighborhood. Though all those variables created 54 different combinations of variables. So we looked at 54 different typologies basically, and tried to think about which ones of these are important, which ones of these variables matter when thinking about displacement policies. So as a result of that, we created 5 community typologies that we thought kind of most reflect the key data. Those are listed here in the different colored boxes on the right. And I'll kind of walk you through how we got there. So we said, let's look at the displacement risk. Is displacement risk enough of a data point to help us identify the different displacement policies that a neighborhood needs? When we looked at displacement risk tracks that we called active displacement risk tracks, this is tracks where there's ongoing displacement according to the existing condition study. We said, okay, it seems to matter whether or not this neighborhood has plans for a mobility hub. And I'll explain more in detail this, but basically if it has a mobility hub, we've described those, this is just a draft name, as redeveloping urban communities. When you look at the map, you'll see these are generally the urban parts of the San Diego region that are well served by transit. These tend to be areas that have a lot of displacement and have plans for future growth and development. Then we looked at places with active displacement that do not have a mobility hub plan. And these tended to be suburban and exurban communities, not well served by transit, are not places that the region has identified are priority for new housing because of the low transit. And we also found that these areas tended to be some of our most racially diverse areas. So we called those racially diverse suburban and exurban communities. Then we looked at our at-risk tracts. So these are tracts, they don't have a lot of ongoing displacement to be considered an active displacement risk tract, but they also are not low risk. They have some risk of displacement. And when we looked at these, we saw, aha, it seems that whether or not there's affordability remaining matters for displacement policies. So we kind of split these into roughly higher cost communities and lower cost communities. We're still kind of workshopping the titles, but these are at-risk communities, some of which have some affordability, some of which don't. And then we looked at low-risk displacement tracts, and we said these kind of, we can treat them the same. We don't need to parse these out as much, and the policies kind of will apply equally. These tended to be, because they have low displacement risk, they tended to be stable neighborhoods. From a displacement risk standpoint, they're largely homeowners, and they tended to be in coastal and suburban areas. So we call them stable, coastal, and suburban. So we'll explain a little bit more about each of these typologies. I'll give it to Ari to talk about the first one, please.
Absolutely. So Farzad and I will kind of take turns going through these different typologies. So the first one is that I'll be reviewing with you are the redeveloping urban communities. So these are tracts experiencing active displacement that are also within mobility hubs. Other factors that you'll see associated with this typology are, again, the typology or the geographic area is within a mobility hub. And, you'll tend to see higher rates of, renter status. And you'll see that on the next slide as well. So, yeah, so you'll tend to see higher rates of renter status, lower income, and, a higher rate of racial diversity. So, we decided to kind of show one sample tract here. This is an example of a typical census tract that meets this typology criteria. And this is all according to 2019 ACS data. You can see that in this census tract, it's in Central National City, which you can kind of see in that red outline. It's bounded by 8th Street on the north and 18th Street to the south, and National City Boulevard to the west, and Palm Avenue on the east. So for folks who are familiar with National City, it's kind of that downtown core. And this is kind of emblematic of this redeveloping urban community typology, where you see kind of these communities that are in the urban fabric today tend to be majority renter, tend to be lower income, and have an active displacement risk. And you'll see in this case, it's the highest displacement risk possible, highlighted in red. So that's kind of what you can expect in this typology and where you'll generally see them.
The next typology I want to talk about is the second one. As I mentioned, these are tracts that have active displacement but are outside of mobility hubs. So we're thinking of them as these are the tracts that are outside of the areas that have been prioritized for growth and development. So as a result of that, we think the policies to prioritize, because there isn't a lot of growth and development emphasized, our policies around neighborhood stability and preservation of affordability. And then this is one example of those tracts. This is an inland part of Oceanside. So it's mostly south of the 76th freeway and east of El Camino Real. And on the right side of that is Rancho del Orobo. So again, you see some key statistics there. Similar kind of in rent level and income and renter status to the previous typology, but again, outside of kind of the core areas prioritized for new development. Then the third typology, these, as I mentioned, are tracts that are at risk of development, but do not have a lot of remaining affordability. This means that there are very few, I forgot the number, but I think it's less than 100 homes that are affordable to low-income renters, 80% AMI or below. And in these communities, the policies we identified as priority are policies that emphasize stability and production, not preservation, because there is not a lot of remaining affordability. And this is an example of one of those tracts. It's kind of the south part of University City and the north part of Claremont. It's mostly along the 805 towards the right of that tract and on either side of the 52. And then talk briefly about typology 4. This is kind of the sibling of 3. So these are also at-risk tracts, but at-risk tracts that have affordability, that have some meaningful number of units that are affordable to low-income households. And because these have remaining affordability, we thought it's important to emphasize preservation in these tracts, as well as neighborhood stability. And here's an example of one such tract. This is an unincorporated part of San Diego County, south of Mount Helix, north of the 94 freeway. I believe this area is called Casa del Oro. And then, Ari, you could talk about the 5th typology.
Absolutely. This typology we're calling stable coastal and suburban communities. What some of the hallmarks of these communities are, they generally are experiencing a low risk of displacement, which kind of is what characterizes them in comparison to some of the other typologies we reviewed. Other factors that you'll see here are, at a level, the level of affordability is generally unaffordable to renters earning up to 80% of AMI. They tend to be communities that are majority homeowners. And so the policy categories that would be, that would be prescribed for these types of typologies would be a neighborhood stability policies, as well as production policies, especially as it relates to AFFH, and making sure that we're creating opportunities for housing in well-resourced areas. Just to give you an example of what one of these stable coastal and suburban communities might look like, here we're looking at Encinitas Tract 176. You see that the relative displacement risk as defined by our map is low. The median income here is $161,250, so well above median income. Median rent here is $3,014, which again is above the median rent. And renters as a tenure type make up only 20% of the population, which is a lot lower than the median throughout the county. So I think what you're seeing here is a typology that all of us can maybe imagine in our head, and certainly supported by data.
Thank you, Ari. So to conclude, I'm going to review the policies that we've identified as priority for each of these typologies. So again, the typologies that we just reviewed are listed on the left column of this slide. You'll notice that we've identified stability policies as high priority throughout the region. That's kind of one outcome of this study, is that we need stability policies, things like tenant protections, rent stabilization policies, greater access to home ownership. We need those throughout the region. But then depending on the type of community you're looking at, we think either production policies or preservation policies need to be prioritized a little bit differently. So again, some examples when we talk about production policies, we're talking about things like upzoning, inclusionary housing, equitable TOD policies, and others. And we're talking about preservation policies. We're talking about things like acquisition and rehabilitation of market rate housing, extending affordability covenants, hiring local preservation staff, and others. So we would really like to hear, I'll kind of end our presentation here. We'd really like to hear, again, what is this construct helpful, and how does this kind of align with policies that you're implementing? And so I'll turn it over to Ari to walk us through a couple questions that we'd love to hear from you all about.
Thanks, Farzad. So I want to recognize that was a bit of a lightning round as we went through the different typologies, but we want to just get your initial reaction to these different typologies that we've that we've created here based on, again, Farzad walked us through a bit of the methodology of how we came to these conclusions, and looking for those, significant insights in the data that kind of show us that these different communities or typologies exist. But we want to get your input, would thinking about the region in these terms help you use the toolkit to identify, create, and implement anti-displacement policies? We want you to, we want to understand whether they're logical to you or whether they're helpful. So, we're going to just open it up. Obviously, if we're in the room, I'll need some help on the tech side to make sure I hear you. But also, if you're online, feel free to raise your hand, I think, as well.
And one quick question. What source did you use to determine the median rent for census tract?
These are all the data on the slides from 2019 ACS data.
Do you anticipate a lot of change between, because 2019, and I think there's been a significant event that's happened since 2019.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how much do you anticipate median rents to have changed, specifically in San Diego? I'm thinking about flight from San Francisco and stuff like that. I'm wondering, how much do you anticipate that changing?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great point. It's something, the best practice report kind of gets into this, but basically the short answer is yes, we've observed rents have gone up significantly since 2019. 2019 is the last most very reliable ACS data survey, because from 2020 on it became less reliable for various reasons. But yes, it's lower, but we expect it's consistently lower. So as a comparative metric to compare tracts, it's nonetheless a helpful number.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
No, I like this structure. I think it's easy for the public to understand. I think the next question would be, when you talk about the best practices, what are the pros and cons of like rent stabilization, rental assistance? Some of the larger cities can do all of these tools in the toolbox. Smaller cities may not have the ability to do all of these different things. So understanding those are probably the right answers, but we all have limitations as to what we can implement.
And I'm not sure how you'd factor it in, but I think state preemption plays a lot. Like I'm thinking about like with state limits on the amount that rate can be increased. I think, a lot of stuff gets dictated by Sacramento. And I think that, I'm not sure how that would live in your policy recommendations, but I think that is a policy reality that is not often what your local policies are. It's kind of awesome. It's also often driven by the state.
I would also say that everyone is producing toolkits on every topic, right? HCD, OPR, SANDAG, SCAG, every MPO and COG is churning out something. And we all end up with a lot of these kind of ubiquitous policy directions, like tenant stabilization or tenant protections, which get distilled down into rent control. And as soon as rent control comes out of someone's mouth, that everyone flies off in every direction because they get upset. So it almost would be really helpful to have, or I think to have more concrete, detailed implementation examples. I know we're going to a case study, but as an example, and maybe Eric Bungie online can speak a bit to this. This actually might predate him coming on board at Escondido, but we had legal aid come and talk to our housing subcommittee, where they talked about the importance of local jurisdictions adopting state law tenant protections, like just the state law, creating your own ordinance. And no one in that room knew anything about what would actually happen to our residents if we adopted that. And so it was pretty eye-opening, right? And I hadn't heard that. I know our housing manager hadn't heard of that. And so to me, that's like a really tangible thing. And that's really maybe more realistic when dealing with these councils and commissions who maybe aren't pro-housing. And say, we're just adopting state law. And as a result of adopting state law, we open up more opportunities to our residents or our communities through our, legal aid contracts or fair housing providers that are mandated through HUD and whatever else we get money from. So, you know, I know that's really granular, but I think at this point, we have so much generalization and general direction that granularity is like the next step of what we need.
And that's exactly the point I was getting at too, is that, you know, you throw out rent control, you throw out rental assistance. Our communities say, yeah, do it, do it, do it, do it. Well, how am I supposed to do that? I don't have enough dollars to provide rental assistance. There are pros and cons to doing rent stabilization. So from a community perspective, they bite on the policy, but when you talk about granular and how you implement that, the impacts not just to your lower income community, but to your economic impact, to your business community, you need to understand that fully before you start talking implement. And I think we're all in the boat right now that all I ever hear is we're in a crisis, do something, do rent control. It's not that easy to do rent control. There are a lot of implications to that. And so having the granular and walking it all the way through would be helpful, that more of the generalities.
Yeah, and I'll build on the rent control because we at least our department at Escondido oversees mobile home rent control, and it could potentially be an administrative burden even for smaller cities to do something like that. But to build on Veronica's point, yeah, some of these and then some of these tenant protection things are sunsetting too, because some of them were, you know, in place till 2025 COVID related. So that's kind of something to take into consideration too.
Building on this, I think, you know, when I hear a toolkit and I hear an idea for a policy, to me, what's most helpful is give me some code examples, give me some like actual code that other cities have done, that so when, you know, I take it to my boss and they sign off on it, I at least have some kind of framework to work on how that code actually works. Because there's been a couple of times where we've wanted to move forward with the policy and no one else is doing it. It's like, well, we have to start the code ourselves, and if there's examples, or even if there's not existing code, you know, just having some kind of framework of some existing municipal language that could be used, I think that would be helpful.
And so I want to, one thing I'm loving this input, I'm taking notes on all of it, and I think it's very clear. One thing I do want to get your input on is specifically, you know, with the way we've created these like typologies and matching, I guess, types of policies based on what these different typologies, you know, what they're facing, right? Whether that they need, you know, more housing stock, or whether they need more preservation policies, right? Is that a helpful framework, or is what I'm hearing from you, I would rather have, you know, a key set of policies that have a granular level of detail on how they were implemented, on the codes that, you know, are supportive of those policies, and how basically maybe a sketch of, you know, the political maybe, I guess, the political things that need to be enacted in order for it to come to fruition. Is that what I'm hearing? Are these typologies helpful? That's one of the key things I think that would be helpful for us today as we leave this session.
Hey, Ari, I'm going to jump in. So this is Patty. I'm the planning manager at Encinitas, and we have a pretty robust Section 8 voucher program, doing a ton of affordable housing with our housing element implementation. And we do need, like Veronica said, tons of toolkits, not super helpful, because all the things I think you said, I think we all know, and all of these things are applicable across every jurisdiction in San Diego, just given our socioeconomics. So we definitely need more like of the granular level, the details, right? Like sample policies, even education, even funding opportunities, right? Educating our decision makers, right? Because we all want to do these great things, but there's a political framework that we all have to work within, and even educating the decision makers. Like we're in the middle of doing a displacement risk study. And as Joel mentioned earlier, even we've tried so hard to get accurate data And it's very difficult to even get accurate data on that. So we were charged to do a displacement study with our housing element implementation, and the resources aren't even readily available. You know, we're trying to comply and do, great work and have meaningful actions to really comply with our AFFH. And there's just limited resources out there. So I think even funding opportunities, assisting with funding opportunities to help do this, because staffing is an issue, funding is an issue for a lot of cities. And then really the stakeholder education on the decision makers, right? Because we can come up with these wonderful recommendations, but it doesn't mean they're going to be adopted. And really, even like when we start actually providing affordable housing as our housing elements sites, even dealing with displacement of existing housing on site. People, we're still grappling with all of that, because you can't lose any units, whether they're ADUs, detached family, you can't lose that. So even implementing SB 9, and trying to do affordable housing, there's issues associated with it because of the whole displacement issue. So it's not as, I think we all understand the topics, but it's really the implementation piece, and really to advance AFFH, we need the details.
Yeah.
And the data.
I do think, I agree with Patty, but I do think these typologies are useful in that the sense of once you publish all of your documentation, it allows for jurisdictions to provide parallels with other cities. We all have our cities we like to compare ourselves to. This actually might shed some light on more realities. Or jurisdictions maybe that we're not looking at and paralleling ourselves to, just because the data we've been looking at is older, or at the state level or the federal level. So I do think that, and I appreciate that the names are fairly generic, because I know decision makers sometimes like to latch on to names and be like, well, that's not in our community, or that, so I think keeping them more like location based and broad is nice. I'm curious if you took into consideration any of the state, is it the TCAC mapping, which informed a lot of our housing element AFFH components, and we have some high segregation and poverty tracks. And so obviously we want to make sure if this is more region granular data, then okay, great. But if you took that into account, we obviously don't want to have incongruous data potentially with our housing element unless we can follow the logic behind it of, okay, there has been a shift, there's a reasonable change. So
yeah,
I don't know if
that was exactly the question is, for comparative analysis, we got to make sure we're speaking the language of other jurisdictions. And TCAC seems to be is the framework in which we're all comparing.
Because HC makes us, right?
So with these typologies, they're useful to an extent, but at the end of the day, I'm not really looking at stable and coastal and suburban or higher cost inland. I'm looking at, is a higher resources or is this a moderate resource? And what year of moderate resource? Because that's a whole different can of worms with the changing period. So I think in order for it to translate effectively, I think those TCAC resource areas has to be integrated into this analysis somehow.
Thank you for that. We can drill down on that. I'll just say also really briefly, I should have mentioned this earlier. We did this, the existing condition assessment was done in partnership with the Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley, which has worked very closely on TCAC categories as well as the AFFH map. So yeah, they're definitely integrated, but let's also maybe how we describe the typologies we should. Thank you.
I want to be mindful of time and keep things moving, but I also have a question. I'm wondering how big of a problem this is in terms of quantifying. Would you get a chance to take that on?
In terms of quantifying displacement risks?
Just like how many people are maybe affected by displacement?
Oh, that's a good question. There's certainly a way to answer that using the report, but the report didn't specifically say that, but yeah.
Understand that's a challenging question. I'm just wondering, we hear so much about it, what the magnitude really is.
I mean, we're all struggling to understand beyond the anecdotal, because as you said, data is hard to find. And ACS data, while I know it's 2019, that's the best and the most, but that in no way is what we're dealing with
Yeah.
today in 2020.
And so that's another thing, just briefly, I'll say in the existing conditions assessment, if you, for the nerds like me, if you look really closely, read the methodology, you'll see that the urban displacement project also brings in kind of proprietary consumer data,
Yeah.
which is in a way like far more up to date and
Yeah,
reliable.
and that was the issue with fair market rents and
Yep.
coming up with payment standards.
So it wasn't just the 3 data points that you were showing in the typology.
Yeah.
Because we have like, a lot of tracks where we might have a high median income, but also like a, 7% poverty rate. And so there is some displacement going on there. It's just, you just look at the ACS data, it looks like, oh, it's high income and high rent. Those people are fine, but there are people that are, being caught up in the middle.
Yeah.
Did you guys have a second question or is it just this one?
There is a second question, but I feel like Ari, you probably agree we've the comments have addressed, I think. Oh, thank you. Okay. Ari, you would agree that the discussion has addressed the second question too?
Yeah, right. I kind of feel like a lot of your questions and comments kind of address this already, which is what would be needed to make this toolkit a more useful resource for your community. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to recap some of what I heard from all of you, and I'd love you to add anything that I missed. So what I heard you say is a lot of your activities are aligned to the TCAC resource maps. So any kind of way to, I guess, align the typologies to the resource maps would be helpful. And then the other big thing that I think I heard from so many of you was give you granular examples on the implementation for some of the best practices. So if 2 or 3 of the best practices are highlighted for a typology, drill into them and really talk about what are other areas that have enacted this, how much did it cost, how is it implemented, what were the political realities, what was the economic impact and community impact of the policy that was enacted. And you also talked about keeping in mind different laws that are sunsetting or that may be in place at the state level and how those interact with the best practices. And those were some of the big things I took away. Is there anything I'm missing here?
I'll just jump in and note and acknowledge we have received kind of confirmation of that through the chat, and we did receive some comments there that kind of emphasize that as well.
Yeah.
So if nothing else, we can, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you all so much. It's been really splendid. And I'm gonna ask Carrie to please put a link in the chat. So it'll come to a couple
Jeff, I'm gonna bring this over to you.
Oh, is it that quicker?
Hopefully it works. Hopefully it works. If not, throw it back.
For sure. Right on. Thank you all. I really appreciate the overview. That was really helpful. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you get a thumbs up or? All good? All right, that's good to hear. Good afternoon, my name is Jeff Ryan. I'm a development project manager from the city of San Diego, from the housing teams, from the city planning department. Today I'm excited to be talking about anti-displacement policies used by the city of San Diego. Oh, here we are. Okay, now we're cooking. So first we'll frame this with, how many homes are we as a city, how many homes were we tagged with for developing in 2029 through the latest RENA? About 108,000 new homes. Since 2021, we've struggled to meet a pace that's going to meet it. We've developed less than 10% of our 29 requirement with 10,000 new homes. We're particularly struggling with developing low income and moderate income homes. That being said, we have to try to find a balancing act. We have to develop housing, and there emerges a balancing act. We have new development needs, and we have to create market rate homes. We have to create new deed restricted homes, and we do have to create some level of economic growth. But we have to balance that with naturally affordable homes and naturally affordable neighborhoods, and also still provide for opportunities for economic justice and social justice. So I think, you know, being able to find the right development framework that's going to meet our development goals, but do so in an equitable way is, you know, we don't always do it right, but it is a balancing act that we're trying to achieve. It's difficult to talk about displacement without acknowledging redlining. The city of San Diego certainly did experience redlining in this map. The area in red shows areas that were designated as hazardous or not ideal for development. And just as a note, often it's the places that were redlined have depreciated land values or are lower costs of land, and are also some of our most transit rich and closest to downtown and closest to job centers. So that means that often the areas that were the most disproportionately impacted by redlining are also probably the most primed for development because of the land values. And so where we're seeing a lot of intense development is occurring in communities of color, areas that were marginalized and continue to be impacted by these devastating policies. So the way that we generally address anti-displacement in San Diego is through three forms. The first is through the housing element update. It's through our housing element, which we all know is updated every 8 years and is adopted by city council and certified by the state. Through our land development code, we regularly update that through land development code updates and housing action packages and other initiatives. We only got to get approval from city council on that. And then finally, community plan updates. These happen like every 20 to 30 years. It's a long cycle, but these community plan updates are important because that's how we do a lot of our rezoning and our upzoning. And also some of these, as we'll see, some of these community plan areas, some of these community plan updates will also include specific language to regarding gentrification and displacement. As it relates to the housing element, I like to describe to my team that we don't really necessarily have a specific chapter on like displacement or affirmatively furthering fair housing. But I like to see it as a lens by which we review all problems, and that everything that we propose, everything that we do has to be done from this perspective of, all right, how are we affirmatively furthering fair housing? What are we doing to impact these issues? But we do have a specific goal. You know, our housing element is composed of goals and objectives. Goal number 4 does include a policy on policies on preventing displacement. We don't have to go into each individual ones, but objective in, we have about 7 different specific policies that we use that are aimed at just preventing displacement, ranging from engaging community members, partnering with local organizations, using analytical tools, deterring practices that decrease affordable housing supply, and coordinating housing strategies across different communities and sectors. So for the municipal code, what we do, so the municipal code, you know, the land development code is generally how we actually get things done, right? It's where it actually lives. We do that through several ways. Primarily, you can kind of think of it in terms of dwelling unit protections, tenant protections, and then our actual deed restricted affordable housing programs. For dwelling unit protections, we do require deed restricted and naturally affordable units. If there's ever a naturally affordable or deed restricted site, it has to be replaced on site. There are some additional rules that can allow it to be built, like for example, within like a couple miles, or there's there are some opportunities to do off-site development, but generally we do require replaceable affordable units. Replacement units also have to be made available to folks in the same or lower income category. That is one of our requirements. And then within the coastal zone, we also have additional requirements for preserving the bedroom ratios of displaced units. So that one of the areas that the city of San Diego is particularly struggling from is producing family housing and producing homes for folks that need more than one bedroom, right? Just building studio apartments doesn't get the job done. So for tenant protections, you know, these are usually your previous tenants' protected homes. We allow that, you know, they get first right of refusal. Also, tenants of protected dwelling units can stay in their unit up until 6 months before demolition, and they have to receive 12 months notice before demolition. But But unfortunately, a lot of these regulations don't take effect until after 2 years. Some of these have changed though. As of May 25th, our city council passed a tenant protection ordinance. This is like a summarization. There's like a lot more in depth. If you want to learn more about these, I invite you to please go to this website, check out more specifics. But we are now requiring that tenants see protections from day one of their tenancy. So we remove that 2-year requirement. We think this is a really important step in being able to offer renters protection day one. Tenants who are evicted for no fault evictions are entitled to up to 3 months of rent relocation assistance. I think the only way to get 3 months, I think you have to be like a displaced senior citizen. But for, and I think it's like 2 months for everyone else, but it is up to 3 months total rental relocation assistance. It also has more protections and more clarity regarding when substantial remodels can be used for no fault evictions. What we found is that sometimes they would replace like a faucet, and then the landlord would claim that's a substantial remodel, and that would allow them to do a no fault eviction. So now the code provides more specific standards on when these no fault evictions can occur as a result of substantial remodels. And then also tenants also have to receive more notice when substantial renovations happen, and get more options for temporary relocation. I think it's important to specify that producing new affordable housing is a really important part of anti-displacement, because obviously development is going to happen in these communities. But we have to make sure that there's at least, our inclusionary housing, I believe matches state laws, says anything within over 10 homes has to create a certain amount of affordable housing. And within the coastal overlay zone, a new development with 5 or more homes has to create deed restricted affordable housing. But we also go beyond that in how we implement state law too. When life gives you lemons, make lemonade, right? So we kind of view the same way about state preemption and a lot of these state laws that come through. And we like to use these as like, well, if we're going to implement state law, how can we make it better? So for example, we have the bonus accessory dwelling unit program that allows folks, implement state ADU law, but we allow folks to, if they're deed restricted as affordable, they can build for every deed restricted affordable ADU, they can build an additional market rate. And there's no cap on that. You can do theoretically unlimited. But the idea here is that if folks can figure out a way to make a development work by adding accessory dwelling units, and we can get like half of those to be affordable, that's a win. Same thing with state density bonus law. We do implement state density bonus law, but again, like I said, make lemonade, right? So what we do is if state density bonus law says, you get 20% bonus, we might consider like, all right, well, maybe let's say 25%. Let's make our density bonus greater than what the state requires. Let's use this as an opportunity to customize where we can and make it better for what it is. A perfect example of this is the Complete Communities Housing Solutions program. So that program, as opposed to doing the state density bonus law and density increase through it's a FAR bonus, and the FAR bonus is dependent on how well you support climate action goals and stuff like that. But also it requires 40% of your base units have to be deed restricted as of today, and 40% is a much more substantial requirement than a lot of your state density bonus law. So again, I think it's important to stress that when we're looking at preserving and doing anti-displacement, a good defense is a good offense. And if you're going to be doing affordable housing development in at-risk neighborhoods, having a strong affordable housing program where these programs are actually attractive and are usable, you gotta have a good carrot, but I think you also have to have a good stick, right? Like you gotta have something that makes them want to do affordable housing, but you also have to have a strong, pretty arm to require them to build those affordable housing units too. Also through community plan updates. Barrio Logan is a great example. Barrio Logan is just down the road. And when they did their community plan update, it's an area that's experiencing intense development and is at substantial risk of gentrification. So within their community plan, they provided their own requirements for retaining and relocating existing tenants, promoting and preserving affordable housing programs, and providing extended notice. A lot of the protections that were adopted in the tenant protection ordinance, and what we'll review soon with what we're proposing in our second housing action package, is literally taking what the community's ideas were with Daria Logan. They were great ideas, and we're just like, well, all right, let's scale this up and apply this citywide. So what we're also proposing in our housing action package, we touched on this earlier about implementing state law as a great methodology for implementing protections. That's exactly what we're doing with condo conversions. There's already a state law that guarantees a renter first right of refusal for in case their apartment converts into a condo. So what we're proposing is just implementing state law into our municipal code, just so we have more consistency in implementation. We're also, a lot of our dwelling unit protections that I reviewed technically expire in 2025. So what we're doing is we're making these permanent and removing all those expirations so that affordable units are permanently protected. And then we're also directing agencies to identify ways to grant existing residents priority preference to rent for our new deed-restricted affordable units. This is a tricky piece implementation-wise. We've been working with our affordable housing operator, SDHC, on how this would work. We're identifying ways of how that's going to work over the next 3 or 4 years. About what is the legal framework for this, and does it clear? There are some fair housing concerns, but we think this is a really important thing to direct agencies to do, because a big part of displacement is making sure your community can stay. The folks that made your community great can stay in there. Sorry, I tried to be quick. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Or if you'd want to learn more about the housing action package, we're covering a lot more. Our anti-displacement policies or other policies that we're proposing in the housing action package. You can scan the QR code or you can go to the website there, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Jeff. Any burning questions for Jeff on City of San Diego's anti-displacement work? If nothing, I'll keep us moving. And
can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to, what you said earlier about how you all operate through a lens of kind of equity, AFFH, anti-displacement is just really nice to hear, because we go to all these trainings, or in my case, I've been to a couple conferences lately where it's all everything in that vein is a tack on, right? So we continue status quo, business as usual, but here's like the equity tract or the EJ tract or the anti-displacement tract. And so it's nice to hear someone say, no, this is the framework at which we view everything, and trying to get that pushed through our own jurisdiction. It's just nice to see someone doing it and espousing that. So
that's great. Thank you. The way that manifests is, like, for example, in Housing Action Package 2.0, we tailor specific programs to be based on the TCAC area that it's based on. Like, for example, we just recently expanded our transit-oriented development areas, or sustainable development areas, SDA. And a big part of where the SDA applies is based on that TCAC tract. But we had to make some decisions about what year you're based on, how often you update that. But the way that manifests policy-wise is that, for example, our implementation of SB10 as proposed, just by virtue of using the SDA and using that equity lens, almost like 50% of all SB10 qualified parcels as proposed are located within highest resource areas. So it's just one of those things where, like, for us, when we saw that number, we're like, all right, proof is in the pudding. Like, we were justified in using kind of that census tract as a framework for expanding our development.
All right, let's turn it over to Winnie. you able to control the slides, Winnie, or Jeff, you were button that?
Oh, yeah, I am. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Winnie Fong. I'm a principal at Salon Advisors. I'm just want to be mindful of time to start this workshop on time and end on time. So I'm going to truncate my section because I heard at the beginning there's a lot of interest with CLT. So I want to make sure there's enough time for that. So we covered a lot earlier, and I just want to recap the agenda where we're at, starting by framing the context of anti-displacement strategies by implementing your jurisdiction's AFFH and housing elements, followed by a few examples of housing stability, production, and protection, or preservation related strategies. Just very briefly, I think most of us here are familiar with AFFH, which is part of the state mandate that requires local jurisdictions to include AFFH goals and actions in their housing elements. According to HCD in their guidance memo, they require that jurisdictions include goals and actions, including protecting existing residents from displacement. Most, but not all, jurisdictions within the SANDAG region have adopted housing elements currently in compliance with ACD. I should also note that HCD also conducts a very comprehensive review of your jurisdiction's AFFH goals and actions as part of your housing elements, and you will need a compliant housing elements in order to access critical state funding resources from the state related to housing production and preservations. And should also note that the SANDAG Housing TE team is here to support you on this, and the regional anti-displacement toolkit that we presented earlier that SANDAG is producing is a good resource for your jurisdictions to implement your housing element AFFH related goals and actions to displacement. Okay. As mentioned in the previous presentation by Lazar, there are various approaches towards anti-displacement following these three policy areas under production, preservation, and stability. And seeing that stability has a high priority, we're going to spotlight some of these presentations today by looking at tenant protection ordinance and right to counsel, which are short-term policies that you can implement today. And lastly, ending it with a presentation on affordable housing, production and preservation through community land trust, which is also another alternative form of home ownership. So starting with tenant protections, I think we heard from the comments earlier today. There is a state law under AB 1482 that took effect in 2020 and expires in 2030, which provides broad statewide tenant protections. It includes rent cap, just cause eviction protections, and relocation fees for no fault evictions. I won't go into too detailed about what these are, but it's also important to know that not all units are covered and protected by this law. State law exempts properties that are 15 years old or newer. And this is where local jurisdictions can pass tenant protection ordinances to strengthen the statewide protections already in place by imposing stricter requirements for those pursuing no fault causes for units. These ordinances can also expand the definition of or include harsher punishment for harassment and retaliation by landlords, as we heard earlier in the stakeholder engagement takeaways. Many jurisdictions throughout the state have tenant protections or tenant anti-harassment ordinances in place. We heard earlier in the presentation of City of San Diego. Also want to highlight in Chula Vista, they've recently has a tenant protection ordinances in place, which includes similar things such as more tenant relocation assistance, strengthening protections for substantial remodel that can and can't be used for no fault termination, and protecting tenants from landlord harassment above what is allowed in the state law. With that said, with stronger tenant protections through state law and stronger local ordinances, jurisdiction can also provide a suite of services to help tenants understand their rights. And today I want to share with you a good case study example in Los Angeles called Stay Housed LA, which was launched in 2020 in partnership with the city and county of Los Angeles, as well as a group of local community and legal service providers that provide legal services, rental assistance, case management, tenant navigation, outreach, and education. When this program was founded, there was a study that looked at the current conditions of what is happening in LA County. The program found that 10% of the tenants that were facing eviction had no legal representation, while 90% of the landlords did. The study also found that Black and Latino Angelenos are more likely than every other racial group in the county to be rent burdened, as well as experience high rates of eviction. So therefore, providing access to legal representation for tenants facing eviction in these unlawful detainer cases is critical to, is critical to ensuring that they have equitable access to justice and will promote fair and efficient resolution of legal disputes. And this is what the numbers have shown in the past few years of how much tenants they have reached, how many workshops that were conducted and attended by tenants, to legal services, free legal services that were provided to tenants, and the amount of rental assistance that were provided. Through all of this work, I'm proud to announce that the LA County recently approved ordinance to establish a right to counsel ordinance with the goal of ensuring legal representation for eligible tenants throughout the unincorporated areas by next year. And what is right to counsel? Basically, it's an ordinance that provides free legal counsel to all low-income tenants, along with a suite of permanently funded services similar to what I just mentioned in the Stay Housed LA program, with outreach, case management, and rental assistance. In terms of benefits, right to counsel also helps with preventing homelessness caused by evictions. It also helps with supporting overall health, community well-being from the impacts of eviction on people and children. And lastly, right to counsel have seen in other cities cost savings. In a study for LA City, both the city and the county can save millions of dollars in potential costs that can be avoided related to emergency shelter, housing program, healthcare costs, and foster care. So I'm glad I was able to cover everything within 10 minutes. And this is a good time to segue. I just want to give as much time to the group of next speakers to talk about community land trust. And Matt had mentioned who these speakers are. I'll announce them. First, we have Risa Aveles, the founding member of Tierras Indígenas Community Land Trust, as followed by Leo Goldberg, who is a co-director and for policy capacity building for the California Community Network. I'll turn it back to SANDAG and Ascent team to share the slides for the CLT speakers. Oh, you can stop there, yeah.
So hi everyone, I'm Lisa. I'm excited that there's a lot of interest in CLTs. I feel like that's a lot of pressure, but hopefully you all leave the conversation just as interested. So we'll start off talking about why community land trusts as an anti-displacement strategy. So community land trusts really focus on community ownership, and their strategies particularly aimed at supporting low-income and BIPOC communities. And CLT essentially resists displacement because it creates stable, permanent, affordable housing opportunities for families. They establish grassroots democratic control with neighborhood decision-making opportunities. And community land trusts typically provide services that the traditional market does not offer. We'll talk a little bit later about what stewardship in a community land trust looks like. some of the origins of a community land trust are, it was a model that grew out of indigenous and cooperative forms of property ownership throughout multiple different cultures. The more formal, like first ever community land trust was born out of the civil rights movement. This is the New Communities, Inc. This was in Georgia in the 1960s, and the CLT was developed by civil rights leaders. And this New Communities became one of the largest tracts of land owned by African Americans in the United States. And for those who are familiar with the community land trust, I really like this diagram because it's an interesting visual representation of what the model is doing. So at the bottom, you have the parcel of land. The land itself is held in community ownership. And what that means, or what that ensures essentially, is that it is able to stay permanently affordable. It's protected from speculators and common uses, because any decision to sell is held by the community. And then whatever sits on top of the land, the building, the home, the condo, is held in ownership by the specific tenant or the resident. And this provides more security. It allows for families to build equity and for also to gain some sort of intergenerational wealth and stability and inheritance. And then what binds these two things together is what we see in the middle there is the 99-year ground lease. And the ground lease is basically like a traditional contract, right? When you sign with your landlord, you sign a lease. And what this ground lease says is that it's ensuring that there's an exclusive use of the land that continues affordability. So you're basically agreeing that this property is going to be maintained affordable forever. And then when you sell it, that you're going to sell it at an affordable rate to another family who is low income. And we'll dig deeper into this in another slide. And so typically community land trusts host a variety of different housing models. So we'll see this again. There's community ownership of the land, the 99-year ground lease, and then at the top, a CLT can exist on a single family home. There's condominiums, there's multifamily rentals. It doesn't always have to be an ownership model. It can also be affordable rental. And then there's limited equity housing cooperatives, which is essentially tenants own a share of their building. It's not like the traditional, you own your home. It's you own a share of the building, kind of like a co-op, if you think about it. And what's really cool about the community land trust is the model is that it's not exclusive to just housing. It can go beyond non-housing uses. So we see some CLTs that host some urban agriculture. They have land that hosts urban agriculture. They host small businesses. Locally owned businesses are also at a huge risk of displacement. And so CLTs can take they take a role in supporting and stewarding businesses. There's also opportunity for CLTs to maintain open spaces and also hosting a variety of community spaces as well. And these diagrams are taken from the Oakland Community Land Trust up in the Bay Area. They're a very long-standing community land trust that has a lot of properties. And if your city is interested in looking more into how this model is implemented, you can look up the Oakland Community Land Trust. And we see a diversity of projects all throughout the state of California. There are some groups in Santa Ana who are working on an urban garden. And there are some CLTs who are taking on completely new multifamily construction through the traditional tax credit model. There are groups who are preserving apartment buildings that are at risk of becoming market rate. And so the CLT is taking on the acquisition of those buildings to maintain them affordable. There are groups who do mixed use, residential and commercial, and then there are some spaces who are doing just the traditional single family homes. And so what we're trying to get at in this image essentially is that the CLT model is very adaptable to whatever your city needs or whatever your city is whatever is appropriate for the specific community. The model is flexible, and essentially your community members decide what it is they want to see and what they want to preserve.
Sorry.
So this just talks a little bit more about the split ownership model. I know when I first started learning about CLTs, it was really hard to grasp like what it is that they're doing. But again, the model is basically showing that the land is retained by community ownership, which serves communities across decades. And then what we call the improvements, essentially whatever is on the land, is owned completely separately by the people who live there. And then the ground lease again lays out the mutual responsibilities of the CLT and the owner of the improvements. And this ground lease legally ensures that they're going to both maintain their commitments to permanent affordability. And as an entity itself, a community land trust is a nonprofit organization, and like any nonprofit, it's governed by a board. But we like to think of our boards having more of a community controlled structure, and we do that through a membership structure that has a tripartite structure. And essentially what that means is that 1/3 of the board is made up of CLT residents, so the people who actually live in the building themselves. That way they're able to make community decisions about where they're living. They have a say in what happens in the building. Another 1/3 of the board is made up of community members who are the people who live in that neighborhood, who are benefiting from the services of the community land trust. And then another 1/3 of the board is made up by stakeholders representing the public interest, or who bring some sort of community development experience. So you can think of somebody like a financial expert or like a real estate expert who sits on the board to support the CLT. And oftentimes in emerging groups or startup CLTs, there are not many CLT residents, just because they don't have any property or they don't have any buildings where they have tenants. So usually that's offset by adding additional community members to serve on the board. And again, this is just like a template of what CLTs can do, but a lot of groups decide to not have a membership structure. Some groups are just solely ran by the CLT itself. And so it's very flexible as to what your organization wants to do. And so we talk a lot about stewardship in community land trusts, which is a combination of two things. We talk about support services and monitoring and enforcement. And what falls under support services, is that you, Matt?
I didn't touch anything.
Okay, here we go. So when we talk about support services, a CLT can offer services such as financial counseling, foreclosure prevention, community organizing, and resource pooling. And this is essentially to make sure that the people who live in the buildings are well off, that they feel like they can turn to somewhere when they're in financial hardships. And it's really disrupting that traditional like tenant landlord relationship where oftentimes landlords don't provide the services to their tenants, and vice versa. Tenants are afraid to tell their landlord that something's wrong out of fear that the rent will go up. So trying to create a positive relationship between the people who live there and the community land trust. Then on the other hand, you have your monitoring and enforcement, which is like your traditional services, right? Your occupancy requirements, your helping adhere to the rent and resale restrictions, you're providing the property maintenance, and you have an ability to intervene in the emergencies. And the overall goal of having such a strong stewardship in this model is that a CLT wants to make sure that there is long-term stability, affordability, and well-being of both the buildings and the people who live in them. It's not just about taking care of the building, but making sure that the people in them are well off and well taken care of. And this in turn helps create that stability for families. and serves as an anti-displacement strategy. So I'll talk a little bit about some CLT action in San Diego. Our group is Tierras Indígenas Community Land Trust. We're a group of 8 board members who are local residents and organizers, and we're based in what we call the historic barrios of San Diego. So Barrio Logan, Logan Heights, Sherman Heights, Mount Hope, Stockton, Grant Hill, Shelton, and South Crest, basically all the neighborhoods that were redlined in that image. But a lot of the people who were involved in the community plan update and putting in those tenant protections are heavily involved in the CLT. And essentially they were being impacted by gentrification. They were living close to the transit station and realized that their rents were going up. And so a lot of the people came together to figure out what is a solution to help keep the communities who live here in this neighborhood. And so as a group, we developed the Community Land Trust with the goals of decommodifying land and housing, developing without displacement, creating shared neighborhood spaces, creating and stewarding community gardens and urban agriculture. And this one particularly is important to the CLT because the local context is that a lot of these neighborhoods suffer from poor air quality, poor access to natural foods and grocery stores. And so implementing some sort of community garden and urban agriculture was really important. In addition to engaging in environmental restoration, there are a lot of empty lots in these communities that can't even be used because they're brownfields or because they just have an owner who hasn't been to that property in years or lives abroad. And so thinking about how to restore some of these properties to make them useful to the community. A goal is to grow collective consciousness through organizing and education, and also preserving culture and reclaiming indigenousness. And this last one is really, really important for community land trusts because one thing that some CLTs use is they are really interested in how to preserve the culture and identity of a neighborhood. There are groups such as Chinatown CLT who use a CLT to help maintain the cultural identity of a community to make sure that the folks who made that community essentially could stay there. So this is some of the work that we're doing in the community. We're a co-applicant in the Transformative Climate Communities Grant, which is a statewide grant from the Strategic Growth Council. And essentially our role there with our partner Cafe X is to apply for funding to acquire property. And the idea in acquiring property is to provide affordable housing opportunities and ownership opportunities for low-income families of the community. And this is just a picture of our group. We're a predominantly women-led group. We have a very interesting array of expertise on our board, but that's us doing some work in the community. And I'll pass it on to Leo to talk through some of the CLT preservation strategies and some additional examples from other cities. Are you there, Leo?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Brisa, for that great overview of the land trust model, and great to be with you all. I know we only have 10 minutes left, so I'm hoping the organizers are game to share around our slides. And I'm not going to run through the rest of the slides we've prepared, but there's some good resources and case studies in there you might want to take a look at. I'll just make a couple of notes. I think I can control my own slides. There you go. A couple of notes for you, things to look for in that slide deck. One is about CLT homeownership. So as Brisa noted, CLTs do rental, they do homeownership. One of the key pieces of homeownership on the CLT model is that CLT homeownership remains affordable to low and moderate income folks across resales. So unlike many down payment assistance programs where one lucky family gets a subsidy, is able to buy a home they wouldn't otherwise, but when they sell, it's market rate. In the CLT model, folks build equity, they get appreciation in their home equity, but at a rate that is below the market, and that allows the home to be resold to another low and moderate income family. And that's a really key piece of the model. And another is that most of our community land trusts across the state are focused on affordable housing preservation, by which we really mean taking market rate housing, bringing it into the community land trust, and in doing so, bringing it into an affordable housing framework where it'll be permanently affordable. It's part of this nonprofit structure. The residents will no longer be threatened with rent increases, evictions, etc. So we have some nice examples of what preservation on community land trust looks like, and information about a new resource coming out from the state in the coming months that we're hoping will supercharge that community land trust preservation work, and that provides an opportunity for local governments to partner with CLTs on. And on that subject of partnering with CLTs, I'm just going to skip forward to a slide about ways that local governments can and do support and also catalyze the creation of new CLTs. Every CLT needs operating funds. That's especially true for emerging groups. At a certain portfolio size, community land trusts are getting rents and collecting ground lease fees, supporting their own expenses. But for an emerging group, it's really critical to get support from usually local government in terms of staffing and kind of basics like that. Land, whether that's vacant lots or lots with buildings that can be rehabbed, land is something emerging CLTs need. The community land trust model doesn't make it cheaper to buy and develop housing. It makes it cheaper to sustain that housing as affordable. It's a structure really about preserving that housing as affordable across generations, but there's no magic bullet for buying market rate land or paying contractors to develop it. So being able to source that below market rate is really important. And then financing, affordable housing subsidy, of course, for any affordable housing is really critical. So on all three of these fronts, local governments are partnering with CLTs. I have some examples here. We have some really interesting models that you'll see in the slides, including an RFP from the city of Long Beach just last year, where they say, we don't have a community land trust in our area, but we want to see one. So the RFP was for a nonprofit who's going to incubate a community land trust. And in return, the city is going to provide some publicly owned vacant lots, some operating subsidy, and some affordable housing development subsidies. So I think that's a really interesting model to look at. So with that, I want to see if there's any questions or if the organizers need your last 5 minutes. I understand that as well, but would love to take a quick question or two if possible.
I think from our side, we just have some housekeeping things, and while we've got you, Leo, and you, Brisa, do want to open it up for questions and discussions on community land trust if anyone has any thoughts or questions.
I guess I have a couple questions. First is on resolution or kind of like an HOA where you have a tenant that's not maintaining as they should or that kind of thing. Just wondering how governance works in terms of maintaining quality movable property. And then the second question I had is just kind of what is the overall long-term strategy? Because I know sometimes land trusts struggle because there's not enough land, or they struggle to maintain the financing because you kind of have to perpetually gain in order to acquire more property and use that. I'm just kind of curious about what the long-term financing is kind of operating.
Yeah, Brisa, should I get started and you can jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
There was some echo on the first question. Was it about how to deal with challenging tenants? Was that kind of the question?
Yeah, like governance issues related to tenants.
Yeah, well, so one thing I can share is that part of the model is the stewardship that Brisa described, and most CLTs will have staff devoted to resident engagement. Those residents might be homeowners, they might be tenants, they might be a small business or an urban farm. But maintaining that relationship is part of the kind of basic staffing of CLTs. That doesn't mean there won't be challenges, right? And typically those are mediated either through staff or with outside help. We're working on developing resources as a network to provide trained conflict resolution folks to our CLTs, because people living, low-income folks who have long struggled with unstable housing, there's obviously challenges that come up regardless of how stable their new situation is. In terms of governance, the board has representation from residents. I haven't really seen that play out one way or another in terms of like a specific tenant who stops paying or there's some other challenge. That's usually kind of worked out through the stewardship mechanism. In terms of financing, we're really excited about this foreclosure intervention housing preservation program. We're also excited about SB 555, which is a state bill that would define social housing in state law and position us to get resources for social housing, which is an umbrella term that includes community land trusts going forward. So the kind of answer to the financing challenge is generate more resources at the state level. We're also pushing on banks to make good on community benefits agreements, where we've had almost $50 million of funding promised for community ownership and community land trust work. So, we're working a bunch of different directions. There was also an exciting announcement a few months ago about a new statewide community ownership acquisition fund that's being put together by the California Endowment and a bunch of other philanthropies.
Thank you, Leo. Anything to add, Brisa?
I think Leo captured it pretty well.
Any other burning questions on CLTs or otherwise? Let's keep moving to try and wrap things up. If you do have questions, we'll hang out for a little bit longer and take them through chat and follow up. Did you want to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. I'll speak to this next slide. So we just kind of wanted to highlight again that, we're here to support in really any kind of way to implement your housing elements, but specifically on things we just talked about. Feel free to reach out. We have our staffing assistance program. We have just developed kind of not a user's guide, but like a promo of all the kind of things that we can offer under it. We also are going to share like how we've been helping some of the other jurisdictions. So we just really want to emphasize that, we're starting to come to the point where we need to start identifying what projects we're going to be working on with staff. So we're kind of giving a deadline of the end of September to be able to reach out to us and really try to nail down work that we can be supporting you on. I'm going to send out an email. It's going to include kind of this promo of all the options that we can kind of support you with, and then also send out some open office hours where you can just kind of sign up and click on one, and you can drop in, you can meet with us, and we can kind of work that through. We really just want to start getting some ideas of what our team can be supporting everybody on. I'll also mention we're continuing to track legislation. We held a legislation webinar just last week, and we'll be continuing to put out that kind of information. Also kind of continuing down our regional trainings. The next one we're looking at is holding some on objective design standards in the coming probably September-ish or so. So just keep an eye out for those. I'll be reaching out to everybody regarding, and then here's how you can submit your requests, SANDAG_HAPTA, but we'll also, like I said, be sending out emails. And then I want to pass it to Thomas to give an update.
And also just wanted to announce the housing policy and planning tool that we've been talking about soft launched this week. So we have on there some affordable housing case studies, housing policy resources, like regional housing data explorer. And we know that there's going to be a lot of more information coming out, a lot more updates, but would love any and all feedback. And we'll be sending a link out to it after this meeting.
And I think we put this in the chat, but we will be sharing the presentation. This was recorded as well, so that will be available as soon as we can make it available. And then just wanted to give a thank you to Farzad, Ari, Jeff, Winnie, Brisa, and Leo, our speakers today. Quick round of applause. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to everyone participating for your attention and hanging in there for 2 hours of exciting content. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody online.